My intention for this video is to go over some of the misunderstandings with the law of attraction. So almost everybody has heard of the law of attraction and thinks that they know what it's about, or they have questions about it, or they're interested in it. But the understanding of it goes beyond the understanding that the mind can grasp and goes into non-duality. So those two things are essentially seeing the exact same thing. And you start to see as you open your mind to like double meanings of things or non-meanings of things, how this resolves so beautifully. But it seems when we're identified with one perspective over the other that there are conflicts, and we can even start to demonize certain ways of explaining things. And it struck me how similar this is to my Baptist upbringing, where I was kind of like taught and trained to fear and hate Pentecostals. So now, from an outside perspective, I see them as sister denominations. But Baptists are more rational, and Pentecostals are more open to spiritual experiences such as speaking in tongues. So there were a bunch of stories told about how they are opening themselves up to demons, and if you've like gone explored spiritual teachings and come across channeling, you might see some similarities there. But from that perspective, from the Baptist perspective, it looked like they were opening themselves up to some sort of evil way worse than an atheist would be. So even though we were basically believing the same things, there was more like conflict there because we were so similar that the differences seem way worse. And when you think about how everything is relative, it kind of explains why we have such a hard time accepting our relatives, or how we're more likely to find ourselves being really jealous of somebody who's the same gender and the same age and doing the same thing that we are than we are somebody who's doing something completely different. We're more open to being inspired by someone who's in a whole different field and who's whole different age and gender, and we're more likely to listen to them and open to them, which just kind of like goes to show how we tend to identify. And it's not just that we pick apart differences, it's that we confuse the similarities and we confuse what we are. So this same kind of thing, like the differences in denominations within the religion of Christianity, the differences within religions, the same thing is kind of happening, I see, with like non-duality and Neo-Advaita and criticism of Neo-Advaita, kind of like setting yourself up for spiritual bypassing and missing some of the big insights or whatever, and then law of attraction being materialistic, being too involved in the world, or like fraud, or all kinds of like demonizations that we can come up with things, when in reality it's like my pointing out in the last video how nothing lasts forever. If you take that as a statement that negates that nothing lasts forever, that's a kind of a depressing thing. Or that nothing lasts forever, that no identification, that there's no thing that lasts forever. You see it in a completely different positive light, and you start to understand how a sad song sounds beautiful depending on your mood, or it sounds very sad and depressing and pulls you down, that it's not actually the song that's doing it, that you are the source behind that. So the law of attraction all tries to point you to that source that you are already fulfilled, the source of already fulfillment, and that everything good and everything beautiful that comes out of that is an expression from that already fulfillment. It's never trying to secure itself. It's never trying to prove its worth. It's already completely worthy, completely loved, completely loved itself. So one of the first misunderstandings of the law of attraction is, of course, that we are a thing. And that identification with being wanting to be spirit and exclusion of a body, or thinking ourselves to be a body and exclusion of spirit, or confusing the two, starts to confuse us as what material things are. And so law of attraction essentially brings to light that greed is not a terrible sin, but that it's a misunderstanding where we project our fulfillment out into a material object. We believe ourselves to be a material object, and so we believe that material objects will fulfill us. And when we can tap into the flow, the creative power, realizing that we're not the character who needs the resolution of the story, but we're actually the author of the story who is enjoying the entire journey, who's creating the entire journey. A kind of fulfillment comes about, with which everything that manifests or also seems to come about in a form is fully appreciated for what it is, but not actually needed. So another huge misunderstanding with the law of attraction is that we can attract something bad. And so it starts to become really threatening when you hear these things that your thoughts are creating your reality, because from the separate fear-based perspective, and I spent like years kind of questioning this and feeling this, that, oh, I can give myself cancer. This is not a helpful thing for me to think about. This is not a helpful thing for me to go into. And if you feel that way, then it's better to just drop those thoughts and not force yourself to study the law of attraction, because then you can turn the law of attraction into that outside thing that you have to grasp and understand, when in reality it's just pointing to that you already fully, completely understand it. So one of the most absolutely healing aspects of non-duality, awakening, enlightenment, law of attraction, whatever, is that you can't actually attract anything bad. Like, the author of the story writes all this contrast into being. And we hear inspiring stories. There's tons of TED Talks of people who've been born with disabilities and have like transmuted and like alchemy turned it into such a beautiful giving to the world opportunity. And people like the author of Gone with the Wind got her foot run over or some sort of car accident, and then she had nothing to do, so she wrote the book. There's like endless stories like this, and sometimes we don't see the negative events in our life in that same light. So this is essentially what shadow work is doing. So even though from one perspective, again, Baptist Pentecostals, even though from one perspective the law of attraction seems to be completely denying any sort of trauma or painful moments or shadow work, it's actually the fastest way to bringing to light how these things work. So I believe that everybody has examples in their life like this. And I have one that is so personal, I won't tell it in YouTube, but is like undeniable, that like with my obsessive pushing against and thinking about that, I brought this freak event into existence. And at the time I did not, I was not able to see how I had done this. And at the same time though, like in the feeling bad about it, there was like a taking of responsibility there. So even though it seems like the law of attraction is forcing you to take responsibility for your thoughts, and it can kind of bring to light how our intrusive thoughts and repressive thoughts and thoughts we don't want to think are working, and it can make us feel responsible and we don't want to take that responsibility, it's actually pointing to a greater freedom, that we don't have that responsibility, but we do have the freedom to heal and think about something else. So another powerful example of how I did this, and this one is more, the other one was more like a freak thing that I had no control over it happening. It just happened, and it was something that I like thought about that I did not want to have happen. So the other one was more like, actually, you could say it was actually caused by my actions. So I got my ears pierced when I was 17. And at the time I would read, or I'd been reading a bunch of like news articles and stories about people who'd had and lived through these horrible bacterial infections. And so, like, I'd wanted my ears pierced, and I decided to do it, and I decided to take the risk and do it. And I didn't really, like, align with it. I passed out in the store, and then I was so obsessive about them not getting infected that I put alcohol and peroxide on them every single night so they wouldn't get infected. And I didn't realize that that was actually preventing it from healing. So I ended up in the emergency room with it infected because I was so going to control that that wasn't going to happen to me, that if I just left it alone, this is what the law of attraction is kind of showing you, that we don't have to control everything with our actions. We don't have to secure everything with our actions. That sometimes if we would just leave it alone, that it can heal. One of the things that the law of attraction really brought to light was that I had all these much deeper desires that seemed to be buried under more surface desires that I had to kind of let out and sort through to really get to those deeper desires. And because of my worldview, and because I thought that a responsible person focused on amassing security or material life or doing in the world, I'd kind of like covered over and forgotten some of my deeper desires to connect with oneness, to this kind of like spiritual center, to relate to people honestly, to like drop the facades, and to have this kind of like connection and oneness with my environment rather than feeling like I was separate from it and at the mercy of it. So some people kind of take this understanding to be something creepy at first, that they're creating with their thoughts. And again, they go right back to what the law of attraction is trying to point you out of, that I do not want to be creating with my thoughts. I don't want to be responsible for this. And then as you kind of like go with the flow of it, and you see how you're creating with your thoughts, and you see how your feeling towards things is guiding you towards what you want to create, you see some really beautiful manifestations of it. And there's no like judgment as to the worth of those manifestations anymore. Rather, the judgment becomes the love, the resonance, how you feel. And before, we tried to live in a life that was trying to appraise our value and appraise the value of what we have and appraise the value of what we're spending our time doing. And it's the death of that, and it's the realization that it is your own resonance, it is your own connection with who you are, what you truly want is the real value within itself. It is the reward and the fulfillment within itself. So I first heard of the law of attraction when I was pretty young, and there was a lot of like being scared of channeling. I think I was 19 or something when my dad got sick and started getting into Joe Dispenza, and I saw the movie What the Bleep Do We Know? And featured in that is Ramtha, who channels a male entity. And this totally reminded me of like the demon thing and the Pentecostals. And as I was like letting go of the religion and everything, I started to really resonate with Eckhart Tolle, and he made so much more sense of some of the verses that Jesus has said. And the law of attraction just kind of slowly came about into my life, and it really was like I had attracted the understanding. And it, at the same time, there was a ton of contrast, and there was a ton of no longer finding like these this peace of mind and this quietude in like dropping the thoughts, but it felt like there was all this stuff that was just like bubbling up underneath the surface. And I also started to feel these like intense connections with things, and becoming intensely like satisfied and fascinated with things that before would have been way too boring to hold my interest. For example, Alice in Wonderland, Moby Dick, Thoreau, starting to read things like that, starting to feel these crazy connections and kind of like I like something was coming, or like I had this sort of creative inspiration from places. And so as a favor, I read a book for a friend, and it ended up being law of attraction based, and I recognized it, and I started doing some of the processes. And one of the most important processes was to write down things that you do just for pleasure and make it a point to do them. And I didn't realize that at the time. I built up such a spiritual ego, and I like refused to wear any makeup. I thought that I had to just look plain all the time or else I wouldn't be spiritual, even if it brought me joy. That I couldn't listen to music, I couldn't watch music videos. And like I dropped all of that. I'd been repressing desires. I thought the spiritual thing to do was just to completely repress your desires and not have them. And so what this ended up doing was exactly what I feared. It ended up causing a whole bunch of discomfort, and I identified a desire to move away, which was kind of a bombshell. And I tried to force it into place. I was doing good with like letting myself enjoy things again much more freely. But with these bigger things, I thought that I was going to be able to force them into place. So I remember making myself miserable about this, like should or shouldn't I move? And I trying to take some action and making some phone calls that were really not a good idea to go ahead and do at that time. It was a complete misunderstanding of the law of attraction. But I remember, like, this is sort of the grace of it, desperately typing into YouTube, should I move? And up comes Abraham Hicks. And before, I thought it was some sort of like fraudulent, weird dude, and like just the whole name just, ugh, it did not like it. But I was so asking at that point that I listened to the video and immediately just absolutely loved what she said. And like all of it just hit me on so many different ways. I remember one of the big insights was her story about a kid watching a Disney parade and being and her not being pleased with it, and her mother saying, "It's for you, it's all for you," and the kid being like, "No, it's not for me, it's for all these other people," and realizing that I'd lived my life like that, that I was always like killing the magic in the parade because it's for all these other people, it's not for me. And her talking about death and how when you lose someone, you look for them where they are. And not that you don't notice that they're gone. You look for them where they are. And it sounds so insane, and yet my dog was dying and my grandmother was dying. And shortly after that, my grandmother died, and the night she died, I sent her, like I imagined that she was suffering, and so I sent her love and this healing, like in breath, out breath, Tonglen practice. And I felt it like come back, like, this is for you. It's exactly what it felt like you're projecting this is for you. And I think it was like a half hour later, I got the message that she had passed away. And it was so... I remember one of the things I tried to use law of attraction to force and control into being was that winter was one of the hardest winters of my life, and my kitchen sink drain stopped working. It ended up being plugged up, like so far down that the whole yard had to be dug up. But at the time I didn't know this. We thought it might be frozen or it might just be a small clog. I hired a plumber. He installed a vent. I had to like pay for a plumber to install a vent. We snaked it several times. I had several people come and look at it. Nobody could fix it. And at the time I had 2 little kids. My grandmother's $10,000 life insurance was too much to make her eligible to go in the nursing home, so my family was taking care of her. So I lost all the help with my kids, and at the same time, she was dying and I couldn't drag the kids there. So I was so secluded, like at the end of the winter, no kitchen sink, dog is dying, like randomly getting sick and making messes in the house, and then randomly just getting completely better, and me not knowing if I should put the dog down or not. Just like all these things happening. And so my grandmother passed away, and like I remember like all during this time like trying to like imagine the sink drain working and trying to like force and control this through, and it ended up being weeks, because we had to wait until spring came to dig up the entire thing. So after my grandmother died, everything started getting kind of weird. I was able to like connect and see things, and just felt this intense love. I felt so much love for her, more love for her than I ever felt when she was living. And she was my neighbor growing up. We were very, very close. I could just like walk down to her house and visit her. She was always sitting right there and always happy to see you. And so things really started to come together, and at that point, like, I can't even describe all of the synchronicities and all the things that came together, but it ended up in the biggest, like, shift, the awakening, and it was just like I was sent into this whole new, like, I could see from source, I could see how wonderful all this was, I could see that this was a game that I was not, like, it was here for fun. This is a game for fun. It's not a game that we're playing for keeps. But it's fun. And just in that realization, and the realization that there's no death, I just cannot describe the, like, bliss and peace that lasted for days. And that's all it was. It's just a realization, like, that this is for fun. This is for you. This is already fulfilled. That everything that comes out of this is just extra. It's just an expression of what's already good. So, the sink drain. So, eventually spring comes, and I hire someone to dig up the yard. And that morning, I listened to this song. It's called Electric Love by Borns. And when I first discovered that song, I was so blown away that I had to, like, memorize lyrics so I could find it again. And there's a line in the song that says, it's lightning in a bottle. And so I heard that line. This was before the people came to dig up the plumbing. And so I heard that line, and I was like, wow. And it really struck me. And then I got thinking about it, and I was like, I think I used to have a design. I used to make these glass bottles, and I called them, like, fireworks in a bottle and lightning in a bottle. And maybe I should bring that design back. So the people come, and they excavate the whole yard. And I go out to check on how they're doing. And I see sitting on, like, my concrete wall, this antique jar that says lightning on it. There's, like, this was a brand of antique jars. And it was just like, it sounds like one of those silly things, but there you go. Like, that's, like, not unsuspecting how you create your reality. So, while they were there, I asked him to dig a grave for my dog, because I had decided, like, finally decided that week I was going to put him down because he was just getting so sick. And I hated the idea of it. I just really wanted him to die, like, naturally, and I intuition and said not to put him down. But that week I decided that was the right thing to do, and so I had set it up with my dad that he would come with me, and, like, so we could drive him back. So, while the guy had the excavator there, I asked him to dig a grave for my dog under the apple tree in the backyard. And so he did that, and they were really good to me, and they left. And the next morning, I got up really early before anybody else, and the dog passed away on his own that morning. And so I went out and took care of him myself, and it was just like the loss and the grief, and realizing that, like, I could feel it all fully, that it could all be, and yet the law of attraction isn't about getting the things that you want or getting the things that you need to get right. It's really about realizing that it already is that. The law of attraction says that like unto like is attracted, and that there is no exclusion. So your feeling is the best gauge of this. So when you're feeling satisfied, when you're feeling inspired or appreciation, good things are coming to you. And when you're feeling bad, then you're pushing them away in how this is explained. So not really, but that's how it seems in your experience. So there's no exclusion, which is the same thing as non-duality. So we can't say, I do not want something. I do not want my earlobes to get infected, because us giving us that thought brings it. We don't get the ability to exclude. So this is such a funny thing, because in thought, it seems as if we can exclude and we can combine things. So identification is an exclusion and a combination happening at once, which gets really confusing. And so this is exactly why we cannot, why hate is the form of love, a convoluted form of love that's not actually allowing ourselves the enjoyment of loving. And why it explains again why we tend to hate most the people who are the most like us, which is such an interesting phenomenon. So nothing is actually wasted. So it seems as if we're like wasting our lives of not understanding this, and so now we're learning, we're waking up to these things, and everything's going to be efficient. Other people are wasting, and we're destroying the environment, and there's so much waste, and we're wasting our times, and we're wasting our lives. And you can see the full circle irony of thought when it's saying these things. Actually, in the, oh, this is a waste, that's the actual waste. Actually, in the fear of missing out and the feeling that I'm stuck at home when I could be at this party having fun, is actually cutting ourselves off from the rest and the relaxation and the enjoyment in our home or the creative project that we wanted to be starting, because instead we're thinking about the party. So it's not that we have to get our thoughts right, and it's not that we can get it wrong or anything's wasted. So I have a story that, if you can grasp this as not being crazy, can really kind of bring to light what I'm trying to get across, hopefully a little more clearly. So I mentioned after the awakening just being thrown into this bliss state and realization that I couldn't die, and all these other, just being in that state caused all these other insights to flood in, and things that I observed to be seen in an entirely new way. So one of the most striking instances of this was when I was visiting my parents' house, and someone had gifted my dad with a homemade kefir from locally grass-fed raised cows or something, and it was kind of expensive, and it, for whatever reason, they decided it was bad and they really should pour it down the drain. And so both of them were just what a waste. They're standing over the kitchen sink. It was just this weird moment where both of them are feeling so bad about this waste. And it just hit me, the contrast of that nothing is ever wasted. It's not possible. Nothing can ever be wasted. That where it's not material, but even going beyond that to the realization that in the sort of beautiful sacrifice of that jar of kefir, I got this opportunity to see this. And to understand this. And it's so, reminds me of the perfume that the woman pours over Jesus, and they're like, we could have sold this for the poor. What are you doing? And Jesus is like, you're not always going to have me. And it seems like this kind of like moment of, sometimes you read Jesus's words and they seem a little narcissistic. But really, like, he was like a sacrifice, like this. This is what life is. It's this beautiful sacrifice because there was nothing there to be lost to begin with. And one of the other things I experienced, I was inspired to do during the awakening, was I had this antique ring that I bought after having a couple of miscarriages, and for whatever reason, like, I put my attention into like antiques, and so I bought this ring, and I'd lost my wedding ring at the time, and I decided I would just, like, instead of buying an actual wedding ring as a replacement, I'd wear this one. So I wore it all the time. And it was, like, Victorian, and it wasn't very expensive. The stone was cracked, but for whatever reason, it became my most prized possession. And when I misplaced it, I'd be like, oh, I'd feel bad about it, and I just loved it. I can't even explain. So after the awakening, I was inspired to put it somewhere that, like, everything had come together. And again, I'd have to write a whole book out to, like, explain how this all happened. And just left it for the crows to take. And it just felt like it wasn't a sacrifice, it was a gift. It was just a reflection of, like, what I realized, that nothing can be lost, that it already is. And it's a freeing misunderstanding when you get beyond the loss and the fact that somebody could be fraudulent or take your money or mislead you. And you realize that you yourself are kind of creating that, and at the same time, it's nothing you could be at fault for. And there's also an aspect of this that kind of can read as fraud for whatever reason. And so, there was a book written by a clairvoyant doctor who lived in the 1800s, and I've talked about this in the past in some of my videos, and that's where a lot of these, like, crazy connections came about. And in reading that book, some of my understanding of the law of attraction came about. And one of the most, like, hinging things that made me wonder was he started the book out and he was talking about his childhood, and he talked about how much he absolutely loved going around collecting plants, looking at plants. And as a kid, he decided to, like, put them together and make his own medicines with them. And so, like, at the time, like, the snake oil salesmen, and they had awful doctors, awful medical care, a lot of sick people. There was so much, like, collective desire for healing, and any, like, concoctions to make someone feel better. And he, like, in the book, like, I resonated so much. I could understand, like, that he was earnest, that he was honest, and I recognized in some of my own experience and some of the things I'd been reading, some of what happened. And so he eventually, like, years later, after, like, going about and becoming successful as a stonemason in his own right, started having this ability to channel, like, herbal medicines. It's like he admitted that was something he wanted to do as a kid, wouldn't, and that's what, like, everybody who won't get through the book or read it thinks, is that he was a, what's the term? Like, he was a fraud, and that he was, like, tricking people out of their money. And, like, I saw something and I saw, like, what a giving presence he was just to the entire community, and the testimonies, and the book was written out of him being shut down. because the people thought that he was practicing without a medical license and it was wrong. So he wrote the book, and then he went and got his medical license later in life and went back to doing it. And he was just such an amazing example of it. But that, like, I thought that myself. I'm like, how can this be? How can it be? How can it be that good that I can just put out an intention? I can define what I want, and then going about my life forgetting about it and just like letting in the other good that is, that it can come about. How can it possibly be that good? And accepting that can be a hard thing to do. It means that you stop calling other people frauds, or you realize that you're deceiving yourself into thinking that you could be bad